It's my hope, especially for the Frosh, that these last few weeks have proven to be interesting and exciting, and perhaps that you found ways to settle in here at Tyndale and be inspired or have your it's been quite excellent. So just a few housekeeping items. After the event is over, feel free to linger at the back and take some refreshments. And we will be having a Q&A session after the lecture, so feel free to kind of save your questions until the end. And the room is small enough, so if you have questions, just raise your hand, classroom style, and Dr. Sikkema will respond. So for those of you who are still wondering, maybe like what the Sophia Society is and what in the world are we all about and what we do, what I like to say is that we are a student-led organization that puts on events such as these, where we explore different topics, issues, and disciplines at the intersection of academia and faith. Our main goal is to encourage our fellow students to think critically and to pursue wisdom and truth in everything. Every September, however, the Society likes to host an event specifically on the liberal arts, and we think it's good to discuss why studying disciplines such as literature, philosophy, psychology, and theology are all still very relevant and essential to human flourishing and our faith. Last September, if you remember, we invited Dr. Deborah Bowen from Redeemer University, who talked about how diving into good literature can help us navigate contemporary issues. But this year, however, we are so excited to welcome Dr. Doug Sikkema, who has also hailed all the way from the Hamilton area for tonight. So Dr. Sikkema is an accomplished scholar and prolific writer, primarily researching contemporary American literature, with a particular focus on the ways in which the material world is imagined by Christian writers in a post-secular culture. He's done lots of work on the writings of Christian Wyman, Marilyn Robinson, and Wendell Berry. He is also an associate editor with Common Magazine, co-founder of the Oak Hill Academy, and senior fellow in research at Cardis. So we're very excited to have him lecture for us, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Sikkema.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that lovely welcome. Do I talk into this, or you can all hear me? We're good? Okay. Awesome. All those lists made me just feel as old as I am, so it's good. It's good to see all of you here tonight. Thank you so much for this. I told Tiffany that I'm sort of on a scouting mission. I teach primarily in our core program at Redeemer University, a sort of sister institution of Tyndale, and one of our dreams is to sort of build a kind of intellectual community of undergrads outside of classes, and I actually spoke to all 200 of our first years this morning about the good life and reading good books, and so much of your intellectual life is going to happen outside of your classroom. It's going to happen in coffees and public lectures, so thank you on a Friday night for coming out to this. I appreciate it. So this short talk is called A Hidden World, as you can see right here, and how the humanities help us to regain our sight. And some of you might think your sight doesn't need regaining, so maybe just improving your sight might be a little more accurate. I'm going to break this talk up into sort of three main chunks, and the reason for that is so you can follow kind of where I am, and maybe more importantly, know when we're nearing the finish line of this talk. So the first thing I'm going to do, and maybe I'll just move here so I have some room, is we're going to ask a very basic question. This is me knowing the world and how I see the world. Asking a question, how do I see the world? And I'm going to draw on a few sort of recent philosophers that I've actually found very helpful in kind of challenging some of the maybe default assumptions we have when it comes to how we know or how we see the world. And what I want us to do is actually consider that knowing is a kind of focal or attentional relationship that we have with the world. Okay, so that's kind of part one. Part two, we're going to look at the tools that can blind us. So how do those tools that Heidegger would say are maybe near to hand, or I might say are near to heart, how do they inform how we know and how we see the world? So the tools that we shape will actually in turn start to shape the way that the world shows up for us. And I want us to think a little bit critically about the way that our technological devices often can blind us to reality, our neighbors, ourselves, the world. even God himself. And I like to be interactive, so I'm going to ask you guys for a little bit of participation at that point. And then third, I want us to consider how the humanities might be sort of equipment by which we can live. And this is a term that comes from the American scholar Kenneth Burke. So how are books in the humanities vital for a full life in community, and that they can only become this, I'm going to argue, if and when we don't just look at them, but we start to look through them. And when we start to look through them, we can see sort of the radical likeness and otherness of the face of our neighbor. We can actually see a groaning creation that still shines forth the glory of its creator. That we can actually hear the intricate silences of our interior life, and maybe even hear the voice of God. So that's impossibly ambitious for 30 minutes together, but let's do it. Okay, so the first question I want us to ask is, how do we know the world? So the question I have for you is, who here knows how to ride a bike? Awesome, okay, and I won't ask the reverse shame-filled question of who doesn't know how to ride a bike. So that's good, most of us know how to ride a bike. Learning to ride a bike, it's actually one of maybe 1,000 different examples I could use for us to think about how we as creatures come to know the world. So the first time you get on a bike, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about how fast you're going to go down a hill, what it's like to climb? Okay, if you could go all the way back when, maybe for some of you it's not that long ago, but for maybe a lot of you it's a long time ago, you're not thinking about that. If you're like me, you're probably thinking, how do I not kill myself, right? How do I survive this? Your body, if you can go back to that young self, I think it was about 5 or 6, it feels awkward. It feels strange. You're paying attention to everything. You're paying attention to how your feet are moving the pedals, how your hands are moving the handlebars, how your core is kind of keeping its balance, that you're maybe looking at the road, but your mind is firing on all cylinders, trying to make sense of it. True story, when I was 5, I think my parents had one of the first VHS camcorders. So we have actual footage of me learning how to ride a bike, driving straight into a basketball pole and falling down, because I was also worried about how I looked on the camera. So the whole time I'm like this, I'm looking at the camera, and it was like instant karma. So what actually happens to us as we keep on practicing riding a bike, right? We don't stay in this awkward state of like hyper attention to all the little mechanics of our bikes and of our bodies. Right? If we actually did this, we would go nowhere. What actually happens is our bodies start to know in the fullest sense. There's muscle development, there's muscle memory, neural networks are being created. Our body's learning how to adjust, how to control our handles, how to look ahead for danger. And all the little parts that go into riding a bike start to become integrated into a unified new pattern. And before we know it, right, we're flying down hills on our bike. We're feeling exhilarated, and this is, again, no shame if you've never got to this status of bike riding, right? But we can undertake this with a new body of knowledge. By learning to ride our bike, all of a sudden the world starts to show up for us in new ways. Okay, so what's the big deal with this? I've actually been drawn to this analogy by the work of the philosopher Esther Meek. Esther Meek is an epistemologist. She's actually recently retired, but I think a true philosopher never retires. So she's still writing books on epistemology, which is basically a fancy word for how do we know what we know? How can we be certain of the things that of what we know? And her work leans on a French philosopher named Michael Polanyi, who was actually a Hungarian chemist. And he did a lot of work to challenge kind of scientism and the kind of default postures to knowing of positivism. Are you guys tracking? You guys know what positivism is, or scientism, if I talk about it? Okay, great. So Polanyi, as a scientist, actually spent a lot of his life challenging a default way of knowing in his profession that he thought was leaking out into the wider culture. And in this view, knowledge, or what we really knew, was a bunch of sort of discrete bits of information, detached facts that were observed by disinterested and detached scientists. Okay? Knowledge, or real knowledge, would actually be gathered into a large body of certain, absolute, objective facts that we would call information. So Polanyi, as a scientist, he was actually very unsatisfied with this picture. He said it was kind of a caricature of the scientific enterprise. And he said most scientists who learn anything actually learn a lot like that little kid riding his bike. Okay? And what he meant by that was true scientists, as practitioners of knowing, would actually move out into the unknown, looking at all the little clues, like detectives, trying to integrate the little elements that they were looking at. And over time, these would get synthesized into possibly observations that we could call laws, right? A provisional kind of picture of the world that could be coherent, but is always subject to some kind of change. So knowledge for Polanyi was deeply personal and subjective. So he publishes this in 1958 in a book called Personal Knowledge. And he says that this kind of knowing is required of everyone: a painter, a poet, a scientist, a mechanic, a bike rider, a theologian, right? All of us know the world this way. And he compares it to being like detectives. We go out looking for clues. We venture out into a dynamic world, responsive to the different ways that it can actually show up for us. All right. So every act of knowledge, Polanyi will argue, is an active integration of different particulars into one large whole that is provisional. Now, again, this will be the kind of most jargony part of our talk, so excuse this. This is Polanyi here. And what he calls this is a very unsexy word called subsidiary focal integration. But it's a really important word, and I actually love the way that he builds this, because I want to start applying this to how we think about the humanities. Okay, so he says subsidiary focal integration is how we over time build our capacity to become knowing bodies. The key word here is focal, okay, because it builds our capacity to focus, right? It has to do with sight, it has to do with perception, the way that we're constantly integrating all that we know into a holistic vision. So riding a bike, if we're going to stick with that example, is possible when we see the world through the bike. We don't look at the bike and all the little particulars we need to make it run. We actually start to inhabit the bike. Or take sports or music. Basketball, a sport I love to play. Fun fact, we used to come here and play against Tyndale. It was a nice little rivalry way back in the day when you guys had a basketball team. It's an increasingly enjoyable game. Was that a joke here? Basketball. Now, basketball is a fun game when you get past all the little habits that you do in practice, right? To just inhabit the court and play the game. Or guitar, something that I very much struggle with, like a novice. But once you learn how to move your hands and make the chords, right, you start to think about music through the instrument. And sports and music, I think, are two really good examples of subsidiary focal integration. You can talk about driving a car, ice skating, reading, writing, debating, using money. Okay, all these are forms of knowing that will alter our perception. Okay? So when these things become part of our second nature, this is what Polanyi talks about, we get to a state that he calls indwelling. Okay, so we actually indwell the world through these different skill sets, through these different bodies of knowledge. We stop seeing the subsidiary and we start to see reality through it. Okay, so far so good. Are we tracking? This is the more technical part of it, some wonky language. Let's get to the tools that blind us. So, if seeing the world is shaped by these different kinds of subsidiary, the question we have to ask ourselves, and this is one that Esther Meek will ask all the time in her different books, is how does the world show up for you? Okay, how does the world reveal itself to you? The way the world shows up has as much to do with sort of how our perception is mediated and shaped by the subsidiary kind of tools that we carry. And these tools, I should know, are both physical, like a guitar or a skateboard or a bike. They're also abstract. They're kind of intellectual paradigms like capitalism or critical theory. They start to shape the way that we look at the world. And the subsidiaries through which we know start to shape what shows up for us. Okay, to make this maybe a little bit easier to grasp, we've all heard the expression, or I hope you have, if you give a child a hammer, right, the world becomes a nail. They start to see all the things that they can hammer with, or if you're like my youngest child, things that you can smash and destroy. Right? That's my youngest son there. Parenting 101, give your kid a chainsaw. And I think that was actually running at the time, but the cover was on it. Okay, now try it yourself. Go for a walk out in the woods. I would suggest don't walk on campus with a chainsaw, but if you go in the woods with a chainsaw, or you go with a notebook, or you go with a sketchbook, right? Or you go with an instrument, you start to notice and attend to different parts of the world, right? The world, Meek will say, will kind of show up to you or reveal itself to you in different kinds of ways. So this kind of begs the question, I think, how does the world show up to many of us in the 21st century with all its potent digital tools that are always near to hand? How is reality perceived and indwelled in a world of highways and cars? And my goodness, I forgot. I lived in Toronto for a while, and just getting here, I was like, oh yeah, this is what Dante's Inferno looks like. Just getting here. Right, but online shopping, right? These things, like the ubiquity of our cell phones, they're always near to hand. How does it actually make the world show up for us? And I don't want to be completely Luddite. There's actually really good ways it makes it show up for us, but this is the interactive part. I want you just to talk to the person right beside you, and I want you to think about what I've been talking about. How does your phone and all the myriad ways that it works, how does it actually make you perceive reality? What are some of the things that you can do with it? What are some of the things that makes you attend to? What are some of the things that makes you focus on? And how do you focus on those things? Okay, so talk with each other. I'm gonna give you like 30 seconds to a minute, and then I want to hear from some of you. What are the things you notice about how your phone makes you attend to our world, to each other, to yourself, maybe even to God? Go for it. Okay, about 10 more seconds. Okay, there's lots of things we could talk about, but again, give a boy a chainsaw. What does the world look like? Give a young man, a young woman a cell phone. What shows up for us? What are some things you guys noticed? Anybody? Yeah.
I noticed that, especially during the era of Zoom, but also just in itself, like, people focus on how they look a lot more than anyone used to. Like, you're always seeing yourself, like, even with a little picture in your story, like, oh, am I sitting here? Is my hair up? And all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Which you wouldn't normally do in a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah. Who's used a Zoom camera as a mirror at some point? Yeah, I have too. Yeah, right. Yeah. So right, the note I had here is like it reveals to us a kind of performativity, right? And it, just like the mirror revolutionized our sense of self, right, way back when. Our phones actually do this at such a high level, right? So we're constantly thinking about kind of performative space, right? Not only how do I look myself, but how am I maybe performing before the face of the thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that are actually within reach of me, which is really unique, right? There's a tool that does that. It actually can broadcast my face to lots of people really quickly if I want to. Anybody else? Yeah. Right. Good. So it's that sense of urgency, the speed at which we need to live our life and be responsive to other people, which is, again, remarkably unique. 30 years ago, people didn't feel the need to connect every single moment, right, all the time. Okay? Which, again, human connectivity is a good thing, right? The scale at which our phones allow it, we can debate that. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah.
Anything you think of, you can distract yourself into, whether it's the news, that's often for me, or work, or who knows, whatever your interest, whatever you're at, being, whatever.
Yeah.
It's just there at your fingertips.
Yeah, I think one of the most dangerous things we do is we call it a phone. All right, it's not a phone. It's like a one-man marching band right beside us 24/7. Like, it does everything, right? Everything you can almost imagine. It's a multi-tool that, like you said, a portal to almost everything at any moment. Good. Anybody else? Let's get one last one. Yeah.
It kind of builds off of that. It ultimately can be access because it gives us an essence of like we're not going to a book where we can be learning more because we're getting us to the one question that gets in the way.
Okay, good. Right. And again, it's a kind of superpower that we all love, right? We all, I think, this is as old as ancient literature, want to be like gods. The phone is as close, I think, as we've gotten as a human species to becoming like God in a lot of very interesting ways. But again, if you read ancient literature, you know trying to become like gods often undoes us. So there's lots of things we can talk about. There's lots of good things that our phones do, and I'm not arguing we should get rid of phones. Okay? The phone, though, gives us a kind of omnipotence, right? And a power of perception where we can see a lot without actually being seen. And we can have pretty much whatever we want, again, depending on your budget. Mine's quite low, so I can't have whatever I want. But I can almost have it immediately, okay? With a swipe of my finger, a book arrives at my door the next day. Like all kinds of vast resources are marshaled because of my will. Again, most people in human history couldn't even fathom that level of power. All right, so I want to just be careful that we don't want to be sort of leaded here. I'm not saying we want to go back to a world without our phones. I don't think we'd want to, but I think it's worth asking, how does this shape our focal integration? A book that I'd highly recommend all of you read at some point is called The Uncontrollability of the World by a sociologist named Hartmut Rosa. And he argues that our modern tools are predicated primarily on a love, above all things, for control. And for several centuries, he argues this desire for control over the world has meant that the real world itself, okay, it actually shows up to us as a sort of point of aggression. That's the term that he uses. It's a site of conflict. It's a site of contention. The world, and this even includes our neighbors, manifests itself as these points of aggression. And just think about how cranky we get when it starts getting cold outside, or how cranky we get when it gets a little too hot, right? And it's probably because we're so conditioned by temperature control, right? That we can actually create spaces where we don't ever have to feel too hot or too cold. This desire for control is what philosopher Norman Wurzbach calls our great disembedding. And he says that we actually imagine ourselves now as humans that are not part of this world, right? We're outside of it, controlling it. Even dealing with other people actually becomes quite a burden because they're not as responsive to us, as manipulable, or as pleasing, let's be honest, as their social avatars make them appear to be online. Andy Crouch, a writer I'm sure many of you are familiar with, he wrote a book called The Life We're Looking For. He says that this modern technology has actually untethered us from living as if we're creatures made for a relationship with the created world. And he sums up our plight and he says this: we have lost much of the world. We're rarely overwhelmed by the wind or the rain or the snow. We rarely see, let alone can name, the stars. And I hope that's not true for some of you. Probably some of you can name the stars. We have lost the sense that we are at home and on a pilgrimage in the vast cosmos, anchored in a rich reality beyond ourselves. So in other words, it seems that the potency of our tools has either consciously or probably most likely unconsciously made us sort of indwell a kind of dehumanized or disembedded form of life, one in which we don't see others, we don't see ourselves, right? We don't see the natural world in the way we ought to. So these tools can blind us. Okay, so what are we to do with this? So let's move to the final point, humanities as possibly equipment for living. And this gentleman here is Kenneth Burke, where this idea comes from. So the humanities, broadly understood, are the disciplines that are meant to help us cultivate what it means to be human. There's probably more that we should discuss about the humanist project that has roots sort of in the European Renaissance. But I want us to just think about this endurance of the term humanities, which suggests that we're still, even if maybe only nominally, interested in an educational project that is about stewarding and creating and cultivating our full humanity. Now, of course, this is highly contested ground, especially in a pluralist culture. But I think that we actually need such humanities programs, particularly in Christian liberal arts places like this place, Tyndale, my own university, Redeemer, in our technocratic, maybe post-secular pluralist society where anti-humanism and transhumanism abound. And I think even Christian teaching is a kind of subsidiary that, when we indwell it, casts a kind of a transformation around how we perceive reality. Okay, but there's real hurdles to like living into this kind of robust view of the humanities, right? Especially humanities that leans on living books of history, philosophy, theology, the arts. So one of the main hurdles to sort of indwelling great books or living books actually has to do with the tools of sort of mass distraction we've been talking about. So just this week, The Atlantic published an article about profs in the Ivy League having a real challenge getting students to read. And the argument I'm making is that we need to indwell great texts. Well, this actually becomes really, really hard to do when we don't actually cultivate habits of reading. Now, I don't know, maybe Tyndale is rarefied air and you don't have the same problems I have at Redeemer, but the habits of reading for undergraduates is getting more and more challenging. That's what we're noticing. And it's not just, oh, those freshmen. It's all of us, even faculty. We're noticing that our attention spans are getting a little bit shorter. So this comes from the article itself. Most students no longer arrive at college prepared to read books. This is what the author says. One student told her instructor, this is at Yale, she had never actually been required to read an entire book through her high school. And again, this might not be true for you, so I'm sorry if I'm preaching to the choir here. Jack Chen, who was a Chinese student of literature at the University of Virginia, he says the students were shutting down when they're confronted with ideas they don't understand. They're less able to persist through a challenging text than they used to be. Daniel Shore, who's the chair of Georgetown's English department, said students have trouble focusing even on a 14-line sonnet without needing to go and check something. Being bored has become unnatural. Reading books, even for pleasure, can't compete with TikTok. This is actually, though, I mean, you've probably all heard this. It's like beating a dead horse. It's like our phones are distracting us, and I think that's the case. I actually find this the more interesting piece of the article. Teachers at many schools shifted from books to short informational passages followed by questions about the author's main idea, mimicking the format of standardized reading comprehension tests. There's no testing skill, one scholar noted, that could be related to, can you sit down and read Tolstoy? If a skill is not easily measured, instructors and district leaders have little incentive to teach it. Okay, you guys all following that? Okay. So I think that last little bit is actually more interesting than us just kind of berating our cell phone usage. We've all heard that before. I think it actually shows that the things that Polanyi was actually fighting against in the 40s and 50s are still very much alive and kicking today in our technocratic age that prioritizes quantification and measurement. Can we turn learning into discrete bits of quanta that we can assess? Okay, so obviously our digital tools are fracturing our attention. But do we create learning environments, right? And this is, I think, on us as faculty, right? That are so obsessed with assessment because assessment leads to a grade leads to a scholarship leads to a diploma, to a job, etc., right? That we need all these things that we can kind of track the paper trail, and it almost becomes a tail wagging the dog, right, of actual learning. So I often remind my students, and they have midterms coming up, maybe just like yourselves, yes, I want them to get an A. Yes, I want them to study hard, but that's not why we do this, right? I'm not doing this so that I can quantify you and put you on some chart where you rank among your peers, right? That's part of it, but that's definitely not all that it is. And sometimes that actually gets in the way of real learning. And I remind them that we read Plato and George Eliot, Thucydides, William Shakespeare, and even maybe Margaret Atwood, because it shines a kind of light onto our path of human experience. And then they come up to me and say, but how do I get an A? And that's usually what they ask. Okay, so like the bike, once we learn to ride it, living books, I think once we learn to inhabit them, can start to shape the world and help us to see through them at the world. Okay, a few more hurdles that get in the way of this. One is that we often, especially in great books programs, will spend so much time looking at books. And I think this is kind of a lingering hangover of like formalist literary studies. Did you guys have this when you studied literature? You made like a Gantt chart of character and plot and symbols and themes. And I think it's like you treat a text like an anesthetized frog in a laboratory, and you dissect all its parts and you kind of pin them up and you make your table. So you can, again, quantify it into kind of information that you can know. I'm not saying that's necessarily the worst way of approaching a text. It is very mind-numbing, but what it does is it focuses so much looking at the particulars, you never actually go back and learn to look through a text. You're looking at the what, not the how. Tolkien, he actually talked about this in an essay he wrote called The Monster and the Critics. You guys familiar with Tolkien? Everybody is? Okay. In The Monster and the Critics, he actually took to task a bunch of academics, he said, who were so busy looking at all the little details of Beowulf that they never actually understood Beowulf. So he tells a little allegory, and this is what he says. There was a man who inherited a field, and he's talking about himself here inheriting the text of Beowulf. And in the field there was an accumulation of old stone, part of an old hall. Of the old stone, some had been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest he took some, and he built a tower. But his friends perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor in order to look for hidden carvings. And he's talking here about modern academics and how they approach literature. They wanted to They wanted to discover where the man's forefather had obtained his building material. Some suspected a deposit of coal under the soil, and they began to dig for it. They forgot even the stones, and they said, "The tower is most interesting." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He's such an odd fellow." Imagine using these old stones to just build a nonsensical tower. Why did he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion. But from the top of the tower, the man had been able to look at the sea. All right, so from Tolkien's perspective, the scholarly endeavor, right, had actually pushed the tower over, the actual edifice of Beowulf. And as Tolkien's metaphor seeks to make plain, right, they couldn't actually appreciate Beowulf as a poem. They couldn't appreciate it as an epic because they're so busy looking at it, they couldn't look alongside it. They couldn't look through it. The other problem we have is not just that we're always obsessed with looking at things, we look through everything, all right? And when we approach literature this way, or great text, or the human tradition, we unmask everything. So this is a kind of, again, the hangover of Marxist, Nietzschean, and Freudian kind of readings. Have you guys heard of the hermeneutic of suspicion? Right? When you approach everything with a kind of hermeneutic of suspicion, you're trained, and this can be very helpful, I'm not against critical theory, to look through something to kind of unmask the power play. Is this about class conflict? Is it about economic conflict? Is it about sexual repression? How do we kind of explore what's fundamentally going on here? These can be very helpful readings, but when we look through everything and see nothing underneath it, that's a kind of blindness. Listen to what C.S. Lewis wrote about this very tradition. You can't go see, it's not a quote. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It's good that a window should be transparent because the street or the garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw the garden too? How if you saw through the garden too? It's no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything becomes transparent. But a wholly transparent world is invisible. To see through everything is the same thing as not seeing. Okay, I know this is a hard thing to sell because I'm arguing that we need to see through books, but I don't mean see through them in this kind of way. So to see through the humanities as equipment for living, and I'll wrap up with just a few examples. What I mean by this is, how do we recover the sense that great literature must be habitually read and reread, that it kind of seeps into our bones? And I hope many of you have books that you go back to every year, or maybe every 2 years. You keep on rereading them. And I'm hesitant to give you a kind of formula, like these are the books you need to have on your nightstand, because everybody's books are going to be different. They're going to mean different things to you. So what follows is just a few of the books that I teach that have meant a lot to me, and I try to teach my students. These are kind of pieces or tools for living well. And these books, when you indwell them, yes, be critical. Yes, look at how they function, look at them. But primarily, learn to look through them. Learn to have them shape how you perceive and how you see reality. So Gilead, this is a book written in 2004 by Marilyn Robinson. And the entire premise of this book is a father who is basically on his deathbed, and he's writing his final letters of wisdom to his young son, who's 7 or 8 years old. He'll never know his dad. So the book takes on a kind of melancholy sort of tone, because you know the father's about to exit this life, and he just ruminates and reflects on the man he was, his family, all the wisdom he can pass on to his child. And the text is written by Marilyn Robinson, and it's filled with passages like this. It says, "The moon looks wonderful in the warm evening light, just as a candle flame looks beautiful in the light of morning. Light within light. And it seems like a metaphor for something. It seems to me to be a metaphor for the human soul, the singular light within the great general light of existence. Or it seems like poetry within language, or wisdom within experience, marriage within friendship, and love. I'll try to remember to use this." And one of the things you get as you steep yourself in the mind of John Ames, who is our narrator, is that he lives as if the world is the theater of God's glory. And you can disagree with some of the things that he says or how he comes across it, but steeping yourself in his narrative gives you a kind of approach to the world that starts to shape and reshape our vision. Now, maybe it's a little on the nose to choose like a Calvinist, very Christian, contemporary writer. The Road, anybody here a fan of The Road, Cormac McCarthy? No? Okay, so homework for this weekend. Go get The Road. This is an amazing book. And The Road is a novel about basically the collapse of not just America, but the entire world. We're basically in this hellish post-apocalyptic landscape. There's been a nuclear war, and it's a father and a son making their way down the interstate to find some semblance of life to hold on to. And the father says this: "He walked out in the gray light, and he stood and he saw for a brief moment the absolute truth of the world, the cold, relentless circling of the intestate earth, darkness implacable, the blind dogs of the sun in the running, the crushing black vacuum of the universe, and somewhere 2 hunted animals, trembling like ground foxes in their cover, borrowed time and borrowed world, and the borrowed eyes with which to sorrow it." Now, one of the things that Cormac McCarthy is getting us to think about is, what does life look like at 0 hour? Who are you when all of life is stripped away? When the things that, again, make us comfortable, like law, order, society, a place to go, work, food, are gone. Who do you become? Do you become animals living in a godless, disenchanted universe? Right? And as you start to unpack the book, it gets you to think about the beautiful acts of kenosis, of pouring out love for a child, right? Feeding them, clothing them, sheltering them. And the father and the son will keep asking, are we carrying the fire, right? The fire of humanity into the future. So McCarthy, in this futuristic dystopian novel, he gives us a kind of way of re-inhabiting now, right? Our life and re-perceiving it. Okay, the last one. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a poet. He, maybe more than any other poet, has helped me rethink how I look at the natural world. And this is from his famous poem on a kingfishers catch fire. "As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw a flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy well, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells each hung bells. Bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same. Deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, and for that I came." So unlike the kind of frictionless superpower that our tools can give us, a poem like this is filled with friction if we allow it to be, right? It actually requires you to sit with it, to be frustrated by it, to be confounded by it, and to reread it, and to hear it, and to listen to the way that the music of the language is meant to represent the music of the things of this world, things that we are just trying to make sense of, to respond to, and to hear. Gerard Manley Hopkins was someone who was very attentive to this kind of mysterious music of the cosmos. So there's a lot more texts and things like that I could pull up. Maybe in discussion we'll talk about that. But when I talk to my students about living fully and using texts to help them live fully as humans, I want them to realize there's an enlargement of themselves that is very good by inhabiting the humanities. There's a creaturely longing that we have to be bigger than ourselves, right? To inhabit the mind of another, to see the world through somebody else's eye. At the end of his book on reading, C.S. Lewis says this: "In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and women, and I remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad of eyes, but it's still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself, and yet I am never more myself than when I do." And I think it's when we inhabit reading this way and give ourselves over to it, right, we do become our full self, and we learn to maybe see aright because of so many things that have actually blinded us or caused us to distort reality. So I'll end there. Thank you. Maybe we'll have time for questions. Yeah, sure. Any?
I actually have to start.
Sure.
So from what I've gathered, it's, so I myself struggle with escaping
Mm-hmm.
technology, escaping outside of the media, escape that uncomfortableness of relying on research, reading the Bible,
Mm.
and so as we are kind of encouraged to sit in reality and sit with literature, do you have any kind of advice for kind of battling that frustration, that uncomfortableness? Because it's in like in a way you're like used to it, but is there any way it's always just scroll, see if anything,
Yeah. Well, you make a good point too. That like reading itself can also be an escape, right? Like we can retreat from the real by hiding in our books. So Tolkien, just to use that example again, he actually talks with this in the essay he wrote on fantasy. Have you guys read On Fairy Stories? Has some of you read that? So On Fairy Stories is a wonderful long essay where he explains his craft of making fantasy, and he actually explains one of the things that people like with fantasy is that it's an escape from the real. You don't have to look at reality because it's like I can go to some medieval world of unicorns and centaurs, right? And I think at its worst it can be that. But Tolkien said the reason he wrote his fantasy was to return people. So he used the language of escape and then also consolation and return. So he said there has to be a journey out. And maybe I should talk a little bit more about that. Living in great books, indwelling them, is a kind of quest. It's a journey into a world created by an author. But that has to be followed by the return, right? It's like there and back again. A Hobbit's tale, right? So you kind of have to go out and you have to come back to the real. So our phones can be just as distracting as a life of books, which it fails to engage with the messiness of real people, right? Because again, books are a kind of mediation that can be easier to handle than real people in the present. So yeah, I should probably put a more pronounced point on that, but it's a helpful reminder that dealing with reality is filled with friction, it's filled with mess, but it is what we're required to do.
Isn't it really not safe?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was interesting. So I'm used to all that.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about this kind of before, the kind of post-COVID world where we got so used to living kind of through the mediation of our devices. And we're still seeing that for some people, there's a burden of being in community with people, right? It can be challenging, it could be awkward, there could be awkward pauses, there could be, you don't know what to expect. I forget who said the comment about our phones help us to kind of prepare our face for the face that we're going to meet. In real time, you don't always have that constant feedback loop, right? And when you get a little bit too used to that, you forget that it's actually very good for us to just be face to face without looking at my own face at the same time. Okay. It's a good question. Anybody else?
Actually, up in the
Yeah.
just one more. So going back to like the monkey analogy,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of like learning to write about it for the first time and noticing like so many different pieces, I felt that is kind of how I feel in research.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like, I guess my question is like just for I feel like if I'm working on a thesis right
Mm-hmm.
now, and I find that there's just so much, and I'm aware of so many different things and so many different pieces, and it's overwhelming in the sense that I can't manage
Mm-hmm.
one really, like, I can't see. There's so much going on.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any tips in a sense, and especially like in first years as well,
Mm-hmm.
or marketing your project.
Yeah, it's a really good, research is one of those things. It is like a subsidiary, like it's a thing that requires a lot of attention to all the little details and parts of it. And even if it does feel like it's never gotten easier, now you said you're a fourth year, do talk to some first years. And you'll be amazed actually how much you've actually built and learned and are seeing through. And then once you go off to grad school or like, I actually don't think I got into the rhythm of it when I was like fully getting near the end of my PhD. And it was such a grind. But you start to, you're constantly building that knowledge base that you're, like, think of it like a tower. It's getting higher and higher and higher. You're seeing different views from it. But while you're building it, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's getting any easier until you realize all the stuff you now know and are assuming as you approach your next project. So I think there's always going to be a level of struggle with anything that's worth doing because you're venturing out into the unknown. But that knowledge base you have, sometimes you're the worst judge of how much you know until you talk to somebody else. And you realize, oh, all that stuff that seemed like rabbit trails and wastes of time is actually building a kind of deep edifice of knowledge. Again, which is why I think things like AI and ChatGPT are so dangerous because it's such a shortcut to get us away from the struggle and the work. And it's some of the kind of serendipity and the struggle and the friction of really good research that is building a kind of really deep knowledge base that you don't know where it's going to turn up. But when you take like laser-like precision to get an answer to your problem, you've got the thin veneer of knowing, but all that work that you've done with real research has actually been taken from you, which is one of my encouragements for you. And maybe you're in rarefied air here at Tyndale. You guys don't use ChatGPT or don't use things like that. That's good. But it can be a dangerous kind of shortcut to slower forms of learning. But good. Yeah. Reading it, yeah. Yeah, that's like the question. Like that, and that's. I had a whole side of this where I'm like, I could talk for like 2 hours on how do you actually, because what I don't want you to take is like, oh, when you read Gilead, there's like now one way of perceiving reality, because there's not, right? So one of the things I like about what Polanyi is saying about personalized knowledge is don't even assume there's this like objective, truthy truth or really real out there that you can actually grasp, because what you're getting is a kind of what Paul says to the Corinthians, like we see in a mirror dimly, and that kind of provisional grasp on truth. And like Christians can get their hackles up because it sounds like I'm like postmodern relativist here, but I think creaturely contingency is a kind of humility in the project of knowing that we're after. Okay, so that actually allows for something like a conflict of interpretations, and for you to say this poem actually makes me perceive this, and for somebody else to have a different perception, and we can use them in different ways. But I think that's where the fun part of like real conversations with friction in reality can take place. Does that make sense? Which I don't want to say like anything goes, but I can think of a really good example. So we just finished reading the Odyssey with our first years, and you know the end of the Odyssey when Homer has Odysseus finally return home, and he slays all the suitors, and I said, how many of you found this like a satisfying ending? And it was a pretty gendered mix of a lot of guys were saying very satisfying, and a lot of the women were saying not satisfying. And we got into a discussion around like, well, is it our kind of Christian social capital that actually makes us uncomfortable with somebody coming in and just like laying waste to all these people seemingly mercilessly? And then we got into a discussion around things like going on in Ukraine or in Israel. If there has been an injustice, is there something satisfying to a kind of violent justice, right? Is there justification to these suitors who are, by all intents and purposes, stealing from him? It says raping the women. They're actually plotting to kill his son. So, again, it doesn't give us an easy answer, but the way you indwell the Odyssey and think about the end is like it's giving you a kind of language to have the discussion around what's going on in reality. How can it shape my perception of it? Yeah. 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 So I teach a course at Redeemer called Understanding the World Through the Arts or the Humanities, and it's only for non-humanities majors. So I feel like sometimes as a Christian I have to be an apologist. As someone who went to study English, I have to be an apologist. And as someone who teach the humanities to non-humanities majors, you have to be this kind of apologist. So we have a whole course that's actually dedicated to those questions. And the way that I usually tell it to my students is, we're not in the utilitarian kind of game where the only end of this is the job that you want. So kind of get it out of your head that, I'm going to be an accountant or a kinesiologist, or therefore I don't need the arts or great books. So I think of a full human life, right? That part of it will be some encounter with the humanities. But then more than that, the humanities are, again, that broadening of our awareness to help you see the things that you're actually going to be dealing with on the front lines in business, in the lab, or whatever. And you talk to, again, like Bill Gates. Do you guys know what Bill Gates carries around with himself all the time? Not a smartphone. A bag of books, right? He is always reading. And most people that I've met, like in adult life, that are in those spaces, the best ones are deeply read in the humanities. So, because again, a kind of utilitarian cog in a machine is one thing. Someone who's got a highly refined sense of imagination, articulation, eloquence, of thought, of empathy, those are the kinds of things that the humanities can cultivate. So, sometimes it's a completely lost argument. But I keep making it. Yeah.
I feel like others see the value in especially in the world of really focused on STEM. I just feel like it's hard having conversations when we're just, we're mostly about getting like free, getting results. And, for me, sometimes I get into these conversations of communities, widening towards it's just kind of like,
Yeah, and I think I'll be careful because like the humanities generically, like I usually at Redeemer will stress, and I would stress it here too, like Christian humanism is a different thing than just humanism, right? So there is something very important about some of the basic tenets of like Christian anthropology, which is that every single person has an inherent dignity as an image bearer of God. That's not common sense, definitely not anymore. You have to kind of make that argument. But again, in a world, like especially in Ontario, where we have things like MAID that are just completely common among us, and they become kind of status quo. Tell somebody to read like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World from the 1930s, where this was like a dystopian fantasy that we've actually now realized, right? And that's sometimes enough to just defamiliarize the status quo enough to make you think, oh, how have we accepted all of these premises, right? I don't know if that's really answering your question. Like, how do you kind of make that argument? I think it is also in the contested space of like transhumanism or anti-humanism. Is there a kind of Christian introduction to that conversation about a kind of humanism that actually embraces creaturely limits? And we kind of played a little bit with our phones and thinking about how the phones help us know. So much of the scientific and the STEM kind of world, especially the ones that don't have like any kind of first principle moorings, will just keep doing things because we can do it, right? Like, where is the Christian voice in some of those discussions saying, like, we actually shouldn't do this for reasons of our humanity, right? There are lines that we won't cross. There are things that we won't do in the name of advancement, because that kind of advancement is actually not advancing us, right? I imagine if you had Christian people in the humanities, in some of these tech conversations, in my job with Comment Magazine, we actually have a lot of people who work at HP and Tesla and things like that. And they're constantly interested in how their Christianity should inform even how they're constructing things like AI. What are the things that AI shouldn't do? What are some of the curbs we should actually put on ourselves with this? Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.